Everybody, welcome to the second video on Descartes. In this video, we're going to look at the constructive phase of the cogito. The last video looked at the destructive phase. This is going to be the constructive phase. And in many ways, this is the key component of Cartesian rationalism. Let's just remind ourselves where we left off. So if you remember, Descartes posed himself the problem of whether he could have knowledge of the external world, and he wanted to find something that he was 100% sure about. That is, he argued if you could doubt a claim of knowledge in any way, even if by a tiny little sliver, it should be discarded and not used as an instance of knowledge. So we went through, in the destructive phase, examination of the sensory knowledge from senses, empiricism, through the illusion argument and the dream argument, and he dismissed those, if you remember. And then the evil demon argument seemed to suggest that even rational knowledge couldn't be 100% trusted. And he ended up finding that one thing that he was sure about, which is I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And from here, we'll see today that Descartes was able to kind of build up a kind of framework of knowledge resting on this foundation. So the question will be, how do we fill in this side, the constructive side of things? Okay, some extra animations. So let's just be sure we understand where we are. So far, Descartes has shown us that we don't know much about ourselves other than we exist, right? For all we know, we could be a brain in a jar on a shelf somewhere, right? All he knows through cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, all he can say he knows is that he exists and that he knows the content of his mind. That is, if you're experiencing pain, then you know you're experiencing pain. If you're thinking about apples, then you know you're thinking about apples, okay? So the question then is, well, how does Descartes move from this kind of very minimal piece of knowledge that he exists, that he knows the contents of his mind, to create a scheme of knowledge about the external world, right? And the answer is, essentially, he realizes that he requires, or it would be very useful if God existed. If God existed, then it would guarantee the reliability of the senses, and he could have Descartes could have some certainty that when he saw an apple on a bench somewhere, there really was an apple on a bench, okay? So the next move Descartes makes is to try and move from a argument that shows he's the thinking thing to an argument for God, right? Now we're going to look at God in a future unit, or a different unit, and there are lots of different ways to try and argue for God, but most of those begin with some observation about the external world. So an example might be, there's a universe, where did it come from? Or look how complicated life is. How do you explain that complexity? They are very rough starting points for some arguments for God, but of course they begin with an observation about the world. So what Descartes needs is an argument for God that begins with non-observation about the world, but with some rational thoughts and concepts. So there are two arguments that Descartes puts forward for the existence of God, both of which just begin and move from the concept of God. So these are the ontological argument. Firstly, he says, and I should say this is not a Cartesian argument per se, it's an adaptation of a famous argument we'll look at in more detail by St. Anselm. But basically the idea here is that you can have an idea of the most perfect thing. So as a thinking thing, Descartes can think about what it means to be the greatest possible thing, okay? Just think about the idea of that. From that, we can call that thing God. So the greatest conceivable thing that you can think of is God, okay? But, and this is where it gets a bit odd, but it's interesting, if that greatest conceivable thing exists only in my mind and not in reality, then it's not the greatest conceivable thing, because there would be a greater one, that is the one that existed. So what we're saying here is that existence is a great making property. And in order to be the greatest conceivable thing, you need to require the property of existing. So if you say God exists, excuse me, if you say God is the greatest conceivable being, it has to be the case that he exists. Okay? So God defined as the greatest conceivable being must exist, because to deny that he exists is to deny that he is the greatest conceivable being. Okay? Odd, strange. Don't get too bogged down in this. It's worth thinking about. This is the ontological argument, and we're going to look at some objections to this in another unit. But the point here for our discussion of Descartes is that he outlines this and he rehashes this version from the Middle Ages, and he thinks it's a good argument that shows God exists. And importantly, it begins with just thinking about God. It doesn't require any access to the external world. The simplest way to boil this argument down is to say something like, God is perfect, perfection requires existence, therefore God exists. That's the boiled down version of the ontological argument. And there are different types of versions of this argument. This is the one that seems to be most accessible. As I say, if you don't quite fully get this yet, we're going to revisit it, but know that it is an argument for the existence of God based on mere thinking about God. He also, this is Descartes, puts forward something called the trademark argument. And again, the trademark argument is essentially an argument that says, God exists, he must exist, and I know this because of something I can think about. So this is Descartes' argument, and he says basically that I have the idea of perfection. Right? I understand what it means to be the greatest thing. That is something I can think about. But he says, the only way I could understand perfection is if a perfect thing left that idea of perfection in my mind. Right? Unless I'd encountered the perfect thing, or a perfect thing had made me, then I wouldn't be able to understand perfection, because it would be beyond my capacity to understand. But because I do understand perfection, the argument goes, this is evidence that I have some interaction with the perfect thing. The perfect thing is God, and therefore God must be the cause of my ability to think about perfection. Again, odd argument. I don't want to get too held up in this unit. It's an interesting argument, and basically it's called the trademark argument because, in the same way that someone who makes a pot might put their trademark stamp on the bottom of that pot, so the argument goes that God's trademark, when he made us, is our capacity to think about him, perfection. So the fact that we can think about God, or perfection more generally, is evidence that God made us. It's his trademark. Now, Descartes didn't coin the term trademark argument. That is what it's referred to later on by analysis of that argument. So, taken together, the ontological argument and the trademark argument, the first of which, the ontological, is not Descartes, but the second of which is, these seem in Descartes' mind to show that God exists. Right? He seems to have done the thing he set out to do, which was to move from a position where he has shown he's a thinking thing to develop an argument that shows God exists. Now, are there problems with these arguments? Yes, some pretty big problems with these arguments. We're going to get into those later, but for our purposes here, the question that arises next, well, okay, all well and good. Descartes has shown God exists. So what? How does this get us closer to understanding his framework of knowledge? So, Descartes has shown God exists. Excuse me, let me start again. Descartes has shown he exists, and by doing that, he can form an argument that God exists. And if God exists, he's arguing God would not be a deceiver. Okay, that is, God would not have given us our senses and our power to understand things and the capacity to reason then just fool us, deceive us, because that is the action of a non-good thing. God is good, right? So something like, God is no deceiver. To say you're deceiving is to give God a characteristic that we don't believe God has. God created me and gave me a reason, which tells me that my ideas come from external things. If they do not come from external things, then God must be a deceiver. But this is wrong, as we see. Can't be a deceiver. Therefore, material objects exist. Basically, what he's saying here is, if it's not the case that my idea of an apple on a bench is caused by an actual apple on a bench, then God is being mischievous and deceiving me, and he wouldn't do that. Do I make mistakes sometimes? Yes, we saw the illusions, but as long as we are clearly and carefully employing our capacities to reason and our capacities to judge our senses, then Descartes says we have God as a guarantor that what we see and what we experience, what we think is true. Okay? So from this, we can see quite clearly that Descartes is a rationalist. That is, he believed the foundation of knowledge is our capacity to think. He showed that you're a thinking thing, and he ran an argument based on thinking that required no access to the external world to show God exists. And from that, he argued, again, with no need to refer to the external world, that you can be confident your senses and your capacity to reason are true. So Descartes is a rationalist. Now, there are a number of significant objections to this constructive phase of Descartes' thinking. The most important, the one I want you to be aware of, is something called the Cartesian circle. And again, Cartesian is just a fancy word that refers to Descartes, like the Descartes circle. So most people recognize here that Descartes committed a pretty simple fallacy, and it's the fallacy of circular reasoning. And if you remember, circular reasoning is an error in reasoning because it requires both your premise and your conclusions to both be true at the same time. That is, your conclusion proves your conclusion, which is circular. It can't be the case. Okay, so how does that work here? So basically, what Descartes does is he uses God to show that his reason is reliable. But simultaneously, he uses his reason to show that God exists. So it's circular. So he is saying, listen, I can think clearly, and I can therefore run these ontological and trademark arguments and show God exists. But in order for him to be confident that those ontological arguments and trademark arguments are working well and not being interfered with by the evil demon, God has to already exist to guarantee them. So it's circular. So again, I'm certain that God exists only because I'm certain of whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive. I'm certain of whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive only because I'm certain that God exists. That is circular reasoning. Okay? So let me go back to 1 second. So, when you're asked for a criticism of the constructive phase of Descartes' thinking here, this is the most obvious place to go, and it's an interesting, I think, a pretty powerful argument against the success of the constructive phase. Of course, you could argue that his arguments for God don't work, and we'll see, as I say, later about those, but certainly the circular reasoning, that is the Cartesian circle, is a pretty powerful objection to the success of the constructive phase. So let's just recap here and see where we are. If you remember again, Descartes set out to show, he asked the question, can I have knowledge of the external world? And in his mind, only things that were 100% certain would count as knowledge. If he could doubt them, he would throw them out the window. So in the destructive phase, he went through the illusion argument and the dream argument and said, well, I can't trust my senses then. And then through the evil demon argument, he said, I can't trust my thinking, my rationality. And he was left, well, I can't know anything. Then he stumbles on this piece of foundational knowledge. I think, therefore I am. And he knows this for sure. He's certain there's no way you can question or doubt, even for a tiny, tiny millisecond, that you exist if you think. Okay, then in a constructive phase, he uses God to justify his senses, and his reason. And to show God exists, he moves from the fact he knows he's the thinking thing and he can trust his contents of his thoughts to run the ontological and the trademark arguments. And in his mind, they successfully show God exists. And then once he's shown God exists, it justifies the use of reason and the use of his senses, because God wouldn't deceive us. So in its entirety, Descartes has shown, he believes, by first of all tearing down the foundations, tearing down the framework of knowledge to its foundation, and then building it back up. He has completed his task of showing that you can, in fact, be confident that you know about the external world and know that your thinking can be clear and true. Okay? Now, as we've talked about with the Cartesian circle, we may say that some of this stuff here is a little bit iffy. We may not agree with this stuff. This seems to be more robust. More people have few people have problems with this stuff, and more people have problems with this stuff. So if we say Descartes hasn't achieved this stuff, then we're left down here somewhere, which is an argument that basically says we exist and we're a thinking thing. That's all he's proven. If you dismiss this stuff, all Descartes' proven is that you're a thinking thing. Okay, I'll pause it there or stop it there, and hopefully that gives you some overview of Descartes' epistemology.